Well, hello everybody. I'm Larry Goulder. I'm a professor here at Stanford. I focus on environmental economics and energy issues. And I'm delighted to introduce the fourth cluster session. The title of this session is, the overall title is Realizing Energy for Sustainable Development, Assessment of the Policies Needed to Address the Challenges. So there's going to be a policy focus here. We're going to have 3 speakers and followed by 2 discussants. I will introduce the speakers right now. Our first speaker is Joyashree Roy, who is an author on Chapter 21 entitled Lifestyles, Wellbeing, and Energy. Joyashree is Professor of Economics and coordinator of the Global Change Program at Jadavpur University in India. And she focuses on the modeling of energy demand, the economics of climate change, and has also been doing a lot of very interesting work on coming up with better measures of sustainability. After Joyashree gives her presentation, which I understand will be exactly 17 minutes long, Mark Jacquard will follow. He's a principal author on Chapter 22, entitled Policies for Energy Systems Transformations. Mark is a professor at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. He's also been a very active participant in the IPCC, especially with the emphasis on renewables, and he's done a lot of work on sustainable energy policy. The third of the 3 speakers, 3 presenters, will be Arnulf Grubler, who's author of Chapter 24 entitled Policies for Energy Technology Innovation Systems. Arnulf is acting program leader of Transitions to New Technologies program at YASA. He's also professor of energy and technology at the Yale School of Forestry and the Environment. And he has made his name and focus on the long-term history as well as predictions of the future of major technological change with emphasis on energy technologies. I'll introduce our 2 discussants later after the 3 presenters have discussed their chapters. So we'll start now with Joyashree Roy.
Good morning, everybody. It's my really pleasure that Sally could really organize something where we all could be here and share our chapters from GEA with all of you. And I must thank Naki and Anand and others for involving me to write this chapter 21, which is on lifestyle, well-being, and energy. In this chapter, what we try to do is that we want to say that there are options beyond the supply side options of energy efficiency and fuel switch. And if we look from the consumer's perspective, then we can see that ultimate energy use is influenced by a number of factors, income and affluence, but also the non-economic factors and the non-technological drivers such as lifestyle, culture, religion, desire for improved well-being and behavior. And we want to say that policies and measures can modify or change lifestyles and preferences. Notions of well-being that are not based on material consumption alone offers new policy options. And also we want to say is that the reduction in energy services demand does not necessarily reduce well-being. And lifestyle changes are an effective and powerful approach to addressing sustainability issues, as it can provide better multiple benefits, better health, low fossil fuel-based mobility, lower emissions, nutrition without reducing socioeconomic status, and adds flexibility to supply-side options. We are already seeing that weakening of income energy coupling. If we look into the statistics, we see that while real GDP, global GDP increased by 1.6 times from 1990 to 2007, the total primary energy use increased by 1.4 times. So what we want to say is, again, that need to look beyond the economic drivers like the behavior, lifestyle choices, culture, religion, etc. And this chapter explores a more fundamental question of whether defining affluence in purely economic terms is an appropriate measure for well-being. And referring to well-being also means addressing not only absolute reduction in energy services, which might be issue for high-income consumers and regions, but also absolute increase in energy services, which are still necessary for a huge percentage of the population in developing countries. In lifestyle issues and behavioral issues, diet matters. And diet is a cultural and religious habit, but it also is an acquired taste. So the statistics again and the different studies show that, say, 90% of Hindus and Buddhists, 75% of Muslims, and 16% of Jews follow dietary restrictions of religion. But if you again look at the acquired taste, then you can see that the global transition is toward more affluent fuel consumption patterns, which are more towards meat consumption, of which 24% is beef, and which is increasing. But there is difference between energy input for plant and meat-based meal may exceed a factor of 10. An internationally connected world through trade, preference for overseas food is changing. We can say it's increasing. And seasonal and fresh food is changing too. And over past few decades, the energy needs for transport, storage, and processing increased in the food sector, especially for meat products. And in high-income countries, food accounts for 17 to 18% of household indirect energy use. This is just to show that how per capita meat consumption across the region is. If you look at this, then you will see that here, you can see the countries there, and then you can compare I'm just comparing US and India, me being from India, and I'm standing here in US, so just you can compare these two. And you can see that the meat consumption is increasing in all the countries, and you see the difference. And in the left-hand side, we are showing the annual per capita consumption of meat. I'll come back to these numbers at some point of time, so I would just say that just keep this in mind. And also it depends from where and how the food is grown. If it is in Sweden, if you want the tropical fruits, imported tropical food to eat, then you can see what is the energy consumption of the fruit you are using sitting in Sweden. If you are, again, growing tomatoes in Sweden by using the greenhouses, then there is, again, energy use is much higher. So it just shows that how energy use varies depending on what kind of fruits and food you are using. I'm not using many more graphs which we have in our chapter, which are really nice to show how the organic food and then the inorganic food you can compare, and how you can compare the vegetarian food and the non-vegetarian food across different countries. But these are just few examples which I'm just trying to show. We also want to say is that besides diet, mobility also matters a lot. And the question comes, so does it vary with the vehicle ownership? But vehicle ownership and energy use are related, but not one-on-one, because if we look into Beijing and Shanghai versus Tokyo, then in Beijing and Shanghai, the vehicle ownership is much less, but the energy use is much more. It's because of the technical efficiency of the automobiles. But in US, both are high because US accounts for 65% of the global passenger kilometer traveled. And mobility is for accessibility, so sometimes living near the workplace reduces the energy use in mobility. And sometimes if it is a short distance, then walking and bicycling can also reduce the energy use in mobility. Telecommuting increases electricity use but reduces primary energy use. But international tourism and private jet usage will increase the primary energy use. And we also show in the chapter that socially there is a trend towards more value for individual freedom, private space, and which are going to increase the private ownership of the automobiles. And the marketing strategy, human settlement design, public transport service status, infrastructure, all these things matters, how the mobility and how energy will be related to each other. So if you look into the direct and the indirect energy use by a household, then also we can see that by an average household, then also you can see that the housing operations or home energy use and the mobility are really high, both direct and the indirect energy consumption. So what we also want to show in this our chapter is that it's possible to influence the preferences because lifestyle choice is an extrinsic factor, it's not an intrinsic factor. And so it's a decision variable which is amenable to change. And the decision variable works at different levels. And one is at the individual level, which is sometimes the consumers undervalue energy saving actions, so that can be influenced by policy. And there are landscape level variables like the culture, values, social norm, environmentalism, etc. And there can be macro level decision making, which is related to the infrastructure design, market price, zoning. So what we want to say is that the knowledge-based interventions to increase individual intention to adopt energy use strategies can have very positive impact. Engaging people requires a constructive response from the community to actual or perceived threats. And it is also necessary to show that the individual consumers or small groups of consumers, that any one person or small group of people can have an enormous impact. It's important to convey these to the individuals. And consumers are important in the design, implementation of public policy and decisions, and also our peer monitoring groups. So there are roles for policies. Laws regulating individual consumption decisions could be supplementary to strengthen the informational impact. Political will to change energy policy, people's support to take on extra burden really matters for the success story building around policies. And it's necessary to build strong environmentalism and sufficiency-led policy strategy, which is addressing the consumption level, not just the relative consumption or the efficiency level, but at the consumption level, are also important. So sometimes people ask, so when we are talking of sufficiency-led policies, so are we really talking about driving heavy private cars, eating meat, or traveling by airplane or private jet should be prohibited or restricted? It's not really so, but what we want to say is that sufficiency means consumption with moderation and prudence, and developing awareness of the consequences of actions beyond monetized cost-benefit analysis and of market beyond local or regional spaces. So there is need for change in top-down decisions in infrastructure design and educating communities. And what we want to say is also that, so there is a time that we really need to look beyond affluence affluence and think in terms of around well-being. And when we talk this, then we are saying that we need to change our notions of thinking of consumer in a monodimensional way, thinking of consumer within the binary of rich and poor, income expenditure binary, and homogenized lifestyle choices, low human labor and work, and then the acquired dietary choices. So this homogenization, this thinking need to change, and how you can do that if you look at consumer from a multidimensional perspective and can think of, consumer, their behavior is determined not just by the determinant of well-being, but also by the constituents of well-being, like health, happiness, and freedom. Then you really allow for more diverse lifestyle choices. Walking, cycling, non-motorized means of transport also becomes a lifestyle choice. And seasonal, local, cultural, religious dietary choices are not looked down upon as traditional, but they can also become modern lifestyle patterns. And if we are looking into the different statistics again, then we see that you look at different countries, then you can see that if you look at the income, so monodimensional way, if you're really looking, then it's a monotonically increasing variable which we all are looking for. But if you are looking for index for sustainable economic welfare, then you can see that every country shows a peak, and so which it really shows that the well-being and income really becomes weaker beyond a point. So if you are really, so ever-increasing income cannot always lead to well-being. So there needs to be re-look into these numbers, and then we really need to decide whether we are really looking for increasing well-being or we are really looking for increasing income. So there is a choice, a time has come when we can make this choice. So what we are trying to say is that if we are really looking into these kind of a different kind of lens or more broader lens, then we can have more additional entry point for changing the behavior. So I'm just giving an example that we saw that in many of the studies, it shows that you can just reduce the phantom load, right? At night we can see that many of our plug points are showing the green lights on, which simply means it's plugged on and power is flowing, but then we are really not running the computer. So we can just switch off those. And that is the phantom load. And if you can reduce those, then for an average household, you can see that 10% of an energy bill can go down if we are really switching off the phantom load. And we cannot do that simply because infrastructurally, the switches are put in such a way that you really do not feel it convenient to switch off all the time. And so these are some of the infrastructural issues which just goes beyond the individual behavior. And there are, if you can limit the lean meat consumption per year, like the meat consumption figure which I showed from the FAO statistics, then we saw that there is a health standard which is defined by 62 kgs of per capita annual consumption of meat by the American Heart Association. And there are 54 countries who are well above this limit. So we just took that if everybody is eating healthy, which is health-related, better health orientation of meat consumption, then we can see that 1.4% of current primary energy use can be reduced. And then we looked into the healthy mobility styles also. There are certain standards with those we looked into, and then we could see that right now we can reduce 1.3% of primary energy use just by making this health as an entry point. So there is important need for looking into these additional entry points and emerging corporate citizenship practices, donations and gifts of environmental programs. So many corporates really need to look into all these environmentalism as one good entry point for changing, for bringing in human well-being. So what we wanted to identify is also a number of research gaps in into the whole area, and we could see that. So there is important need for research more on new welfare and well-being measures and linking them to the energy used to such alternative measures. Efficiency-led strategies need to be tied to sufficiency to become a widely used strategy that changes values and notions of well-being. And there is need for assessment of the macroeconomic effects of large-scale switches to more efficient, sufficient lifestyles over various timescales in future, because a key issue is how a large reduction in consumption could be absorbed by the economy without generating large unemployment. And simultaneous redistribution of labor could offer a solution, but further analysis is clearly needed. And I must thank my lead authors from Australia, from Switzerland, from India, and from Berkeley for coming up with this Chapter 21, and I'm happy with their contribution. Thank you very much.